I was 28 and had been trying to chase my dreams of being an author by writing for a popular newspaper, but things didn't work out. I had just returned home to help my aging parents on the family farm. It wasn't exactly what I had planned for myself after leaving home years ago, but they were getting older, and managing the place on their own was becoming more of a burden. The farm was quiet and isolated, surrounded by vast fields of corn that stretched out for miles in every direction. The nearest neighbor lived about a 10-minute walk away, a small farm run by an older woman who'd been living there ever since her husband passed away a few years back. Life was slow out there, and I didn't mind that. At that point in my life, slow was exactly what I wanted. Things were pretty normal for a week or two. I was starting to get used to the routine of managing the farm, and the slower pace of life was really beneficial to me. I had a ton of free time on my hands to think and write, which was how I spent most nights. I'm not sure what it is, but I'm most productive and creative at night, so I took advantage of that. I'd get the farm work out of the way well before the sun went down, and then sit at my computer until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. I had opted to stay in the tiny bedroom on the third floor so that I wouldn't bother my parents with my strange sleep habits. I liked it up there. It was cozy and quiet, and the window gave me a beautiful, muse-like view of the farm. But after about another week, I started noticing something odd. Every evening, just before sunset, I would see a figure standing at the far edge of my parents' cornfield, between two rows of corn. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was someone from the neighbor's farm, maybe checking on their land or surveying the crops. They weren't actually on my parents' property, so it's not like they were trespassing or doing anything technically illegal. It was just kind of odd, though. The figure didn't move or make any kind of gesture, just stood there, almost like a scarecrow or mannequin. I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman. Hell, I couldn't even tell if they were facing me. It was unnerving, sure, but I figured it was nothing to worry about. Despite the eeriness of it all, I noted that the scene would definitely make a cool photo. A shadow against the golden backdrop of the evening sky and fields of corn that stretched on forever. A few more days passed, and the figure kept appearing, always around the same time, always around the same spot, just standing there. One night, I watched it extra closely, just to make sure it really wasn't a scarecrow. Eventually, I did notice it move, which confirmed that it was a person. It was strange, but I kept telling myself it was harmless. I even thought it might be the neighbor, the old woman my mother often mentioned. I hadn't seen her since I'd been back, but maybe she had a reason for being out near our property. Either way, there was only so much harm an elderly woman could really cause. Of course, if that were true, I probably wouldn't be writing this all down. In hindsight, it probably wasn't wise to be so nonchalant about the situation. Things started to change over the next few days. The figure began getting closer. Each night, I'd see it between two different rows of corn, always closer to the house. It was still silent and unmoving, but it was definitely closer each night. I was sure of that. I still couldn't make out any details about them from that distance, but things were getting serious now. Whoever was out there was deliberately getting closer and closer to my parents' property. After 2 nights of this, I decided I had to do something. The next morning, I told my parents about what I had been noticing the past few weeks. My mom brushed it off and told me that it was most likely the neighbor's son, who had always been a bit of an oddball. According to her, to call him an oddball was a bit of an understatement, but my mom was always one to put things nicely. To my surprise, they didn't seem concerned or even weirded out. They told me that I should just let him be, as he was harmless. One evening, as I was working late in the barn, I glanced toward the edge of the field and felt my stomach drop. The figure was no longer at the far edge of the cornfield. It was standing just outside the property line, much closer than before. A cold chill ran through me. I wiped my hands on my jeans and, feeling a mix of unease and frustration, I decided to approach it. I needed a better look. I walked to the edge of the field and yelled, "Who's there?" But as soon as I got close, the figure turned and sprinted between a row of corn. I went to chase it, but as I was turning the corner, I literally saw him dive into a row of corn, disappearing from sight. My heart was pounding as I stood there scanning the field, but there was no way I'd be able to find him. It's not like I was going to start searching blindly through the corn stalks. I was really freaked out at that point. Even if that had been a troubled kid, I don't think I was comfortable with him on the property. The next morning, I headed over to the neighbor's farm, hoping to clear things up. The old woman answered the door, so I just asked her bluntly, without sugarcoating things. She seemed really confused when I told her about what was happening. She shook her head slowly and told me she hadn't been outside after dark for weeks because of her health. She told me that she could barely get around, let alone walk to the edge of her land. I then asked her about her son. She told me that he left home years ago and hadn't lived with her since. I froze as she told me that. I could feel my skin start to itch. Whoever I had chased the day before wasn't her son, it was a complete stranger. I left her farm with a growing sense of dread. Whoever or whatever was lurking near the cornfield wasn't from her place. I immediately told my parents about what she said, and they grew concerned. My mom suggested calling the police, but my dad insisted that would be a waste of time since they hadn't actually done anything illegal. My dad instructed me to stay awake and wake him up should that person come back, which I agreed to. For the next few days, nothing happened. The figure wasn't there anymore, which was a relief. Maybe they had noticed me confronting my neighbor, or maybe they had simply decided not to return after being chased. Either way, I was relieved. Later that week, I was out in the barn finishing up some chores when everything went dark. When I say dark, I mean it. The entire farm was suddenly plunged into darkness, and the power cut out without warning. All the lights inside and outside the house flickered off. I never carried my phone on me in the barn, so I was truly blind. My heart started racing. I had a feeling I knew what had caused the outage. I fumbled in the dark for the flashlight I knew was nearby. After finding it, I sprinted out of the barn and toward the house before stopping in my tracks. I wanted to run inside, but I knew that would be the cowardly thing to do. I was about to run around the house to check the breaker box when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the cornfield. The realization hit me. That person was on my property, within mere feet of me. I turned and swept the beam of my flashlight across the field, trying to be as quiet as possible. For a moment, nothing happened, just the same rustling sounds. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. I jumped and shakily pointed my light toward the source. There, just a few feet away from the barn, was a man. I could see that now. He had a few patches of hair on an otherwise bald head. He was wearing overalls and staring directly at me with this menacing look. I glanced down at his hands. He was holding a rusty garden trowel. Fear took over me, and I ran. To my horror, I heard him begin to chase after me. I sprinted into the cornfield, hoping to lose him in there. I turned back and saw him in full pursuit, running as fast as he could. My heart pounded as I took a sharp turn, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. Before he could see me, I dove into a row of corn, flattening myself against the ground. I sat there, my chest heaving, trying desperately to muffle the sound of my breathing. Seconds felt like hours as I remained hidden. Then, through the gaps between the corn stalks, I saw him run past me. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. I wanted to make a dash for my phone and call the police, but fear kept me frozen in place. Instead, I sat there in silence, my mind racing, contemplating everything. My situation, my choices, my life. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to crawl out of my hiding spot. Wasting no time, I bolted straight for the house, my legs burning with exhaustion. The entire property was still shrouded in pitch-black darkness, making everything feel even more ominous. As soon as I made it inside, I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and called the police. At the same time, I rushed to wake my parents. The police arrived and thoroughly searched the property, but they found nothing. However, they did find the source of the power outage. Someone had dumped a bucket of water on our breaker panel, shorting it out and cutting off electricity to the entire farm. That realization sent a shiver down my spine. This person hadn't just been lurking. They had deliberately planned to plunge the farm into darkness. The next day, I helped my parents install additional security measures, stronger locks, motion sensor lights, and even a few cameras. I also went over to warn our neighbor, urging her to be careful. She seemed just as disturbed by the whole situation as I was. I stayed on the farm for another month, but nothing happened during that time. Still, when the day finally came for me to leave, I felt a heavy weight in my chest. It killed me to leave my parents alone with the knowledge that someone, some psycho, had been watching us. But life had to go on. They assured me they would be fine, and even hired a farmhand to help with the daily chores, meaning I wasn't really needed there anymore. Even now, this remains the most bizarre and unsettling experience of my life. I still think about it often. The thought that someone was lurking so close, close enough to cut the power, close enough to chase me into the night, haunts me to this day. The corn stalks loomed high above, their dried husks rustling softly in the wind, whispering secrets in the darkness. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow and turned in another direction, only to be met with the same endless walls of towering corn. His breath came in uneven gasps as he struggled to keep calm. The festival had been packed with people, laughter, and the warm glow of carnival lights. It was supposed to be a fun night. The corn maze had been a last-minute decision, a harmless challenge before heading home. But that was hours ago. His phone had died, his flashlight barely flickered, and the laughter of the festival had long faded. Now there was only silence, broken by the occasional rustling in the stalks. He had followed the wooden markers at first, but the paths had twisted and looped back on themselves in ways that made no sense. Panic had set in when he realized he had passed the same broken cornstalk at least 3 times. He should have found the exit by now. Instead, he was deeper in the maze, surrounded by rows of corn that seemed to stretch on forever in every direction. Ethan forced himself to breathe evenly. His best bet was to keep walking in a straight line. Eventually, he had to hit the edge of the field. But as he pressed forward, the dirt path narrowed, the stalks closing in like clawed fingers reaching for him. His flickering flashlight cast shifting shadows on the walls of corn, distorting their shapes into twisted figures. A sharp rustling to his left made him freeze. He turned his head slowly, heart pounding. There was nothing but the corn, unmoving in the still air. Yet the sound had been close, too close. His mind scrambled for rational explanations. The wind? A raccoon? Maybe another person lost like him? "Hello?" he called out, his voice dry and cracking. "Is someone there?" Silence. Ethan swallowed hard and kept moving. The farther he walked, the more the landscape felt unnatural. The rows of corn were too dense, too uniform. The moon, which had been his only reliable source of light, was now barely visible through the thickening canopy of stalks. His surroundings grew darker, the air colder. Then he saw it, something standing in the path ahead. At first, he thought it was another festival decoration, a scarecrow maybe. It wore tattered clothes, its long arms dangling at its sides. But something was off, the way it stood, too rigid. Its head was tilted just slightly, as though listening. The darkness obscured its features, but he could make out the faint curve of something long, something like a beak. Ethan stepped back, gripping his useless flashlight like a weapon. The thing didn't move. He tried to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him, an ordinary scarecrow made eerie by the dim light. Then it took a step forward, his stomach twisted as cold terror gripped him. He turned and ran, tearing through the rows of corn, ignoring the sting of dried leaves against his arms. He didn't care if he lost his way, he just needed to get away. The maze twisted impossibly, paths closing off where they shouldn't be. No matter how far he ran, the corn never seemed to end. His breaths were ragged, his muscles burning. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The thing was still there, not running, not chasing, just standing at the entrance of the path he had just come from, watching. Ethan stumbled forward, gripping his side where a sharp pain stabbed through his ribs. He had to think. He had to find a way out. But with every turn, every new path, the fear clawed deeper into his mind. The corn wasn't just a maze anymore. It was a prison. A faint sound reached him. At first, it was too distant to recognize, but then he heard it clearly, whispering. It came from all around him, weaving through the stalks like a breeze that carried voices. He spun in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, but the whispers seemed to shift, to dance just beyond his reach. Some voices were hushed, almost like a child's giggle. Others were raspy, words he couldn't quite make out. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out reason. Then the whispers stopped. The air became impossibly still. The rustling of corn had ceased, as though the entire field was holding its breath. Then he felt it, a presence behind him. Ethan turned slowly, his body screaming for him to run, but his mind locked in cold terror. The figure was there, closer now. Its beaked mask caught the moonlight, revealing cracked leather, hollow eye sockets that seemed to pull in the darkness around them. The coat it wore hung in tattered folds, blending into the shadows. It raised one long-fingered hand and pointed at him. A sharp whisper slithered into his ear. "Stay." Ethan screamed. He bolted, running faster than he thought possible, his legs numb with terror. The cornfield stretched on, endless, swallowing him whole. The rows blurred together, disorienting, warping. He didn't care where he was going. He just had to move, had to get away. Then suddenly, he burst through the corn and stumbled onto solid ground. The festival lights blazed ahead, people laughing, unaware of the nightmare lurking just beyond the field. Gasping, shaking, Ethan turned to look behind him. The entrance to the maze was empty. The path was clear, the corn undisturbed, but he knew better. Something had been in there with him, watching, waiting, and next time, he might not make it out.